Well, it is an unbelievable treat to be with you all on a Saturday afternoon. I know you have made a good bit of sacrifice. I think somebody left at the 15th green, and it's going to go right back if daylight allows right here. So anytime you give up a Saturday afternoon, I figured, now why did they want me on the 23rd? And I thought, well, probably the Longhorns are not playing. Probably they're off today. But I did see A&M on the TV right as I was transitioning. But, oh well. Well, I thought by being with the session, I would, number one, I would love to know what your experience is in leading this congregation now, because there's just a very complicated state of the church right now. It's really not easy, virtually any place. So if you find interesting complications at a place like this, you need to know that that's pretty much the norm in a whole lot of places. I'll try to describe where it's not a norm and how it is changing in places. But I wanted to just give you some overview and then let you process that for a minute and then let you wrestle with, okay, what would that possibly mean for a place like this? I'm going to do it in two parts, so I'll give you a little break in the middle. I will try not to keep you all the way to 4 o'clock. That would be cruel on a Saturday afternoon. And as I've said once before, as Henry VIII said to his fourth wife, honey, I'm not going to keep you long. Let me go to the company. I'll start with a little personal info. I do teach now at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which is north of Boston. I'm only there really as a professor because of what First Pres did when I was sent from here to go back to seminary, which was my entire education at Boston University was paid for by First Presbyterian Church, San Antonio. Some of you may not have known that, but I am eternally grateful for that vision of what I could, in fact, be called to do. There was a recognition it might be in the U.S., it might be abroad, and I've taught in Zambia, and I've taught in Egypt, and I've taught in Russia for extended periods of time. So both things have actually happened. And it's just that in between, I was a pastor again for 21 years. And part of that came as I was about to graduate. What I was seeing was that most of the people who were professors at that time, which was 1991, actually had very little pastoral experience. And I realized after 5 years here, Sabindon had never let me preach on Christmas Eve. I don't know if y'all noticed that. I never preached on Easter. I never run a stewardship campaign. He wouldn't let me touch anything that was real. I got to preach on Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, and the Sunday after Christmas. Yeah, I know. So I thought maybe I ought to be one before I teach about being one. And so that's why that period in between. But I'm now in my 6th year at Gordon Conwell, and I again am actually in missions now because we have students on our campus from 50 different countries in the world. So rather than going to China, we have 16 Chinese students in our seminary teaching them. We have largest number are Korean, but we have people from Argentina and Tajikistan and Indonesia and India and Pakistan and Zambia and Sierra Leone and Senegal, and you just go on and on. So it's just amazing how the world is right there at Gordon Conwell. Sarah is a full-time pastor these days, and there she is with a good friend of ours, Liz Walker, and Sarah pastors the Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts, which is a very historic church. It is a 1740 church, and it is where the great evangelist George Whitefield is buried directly under the pulpit. I mean, you're literally standing on his, which is just weird. I mean, it's just weird. And so you kind of get this sense of, you know, I imagine him kind of as a rotisserie down there, just turning over. But now this church is an amazing church. Sarah has been a parish associate in it once we got back in the Boston area, and then the pastor was removed, and then they went through a 2-year interim process, and they had asked Sarah, would you like to be considered? And she said, sure. So they made her disappear for 2 years, and during those 2 years, we went to Liz Walker's congregation, which is in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and Liz was the first black CBS anchor in Boston for about 20 years. So she is, I mean, just an amazingly polished woman. God later called her into ministry, and she pastors the one all African-American congregation, which we hung out in for 2 incredible years. But she is now in this church, and if you can imagine this, they have had actually really, really poor, and I didn't use the microphone, so I'm not on, really poor pastoral leadership for 35 years. The person there for 20 years, I would listen. It's the nearest Presbyterian church to our house, so that's got us there. I go, you know, I think that's the worst preacher I've ever heard. I mean, every week, and each week was worse than the one before. And I thought, I can't believe you can't kill this thing off with 20 consecutive years. And then the next person they hired was ever so slightly better as a preacher and worse as a pastor. And so they had 15 more years of that. So Sarah is following 35 incredibly poor years. So pretty much all you got to do is smile like Sarah does, and it's a whole lot better. But the congregation is now starting to see renewal, and she's been there about 8 months and preaching the gospel and loving on people, and so things are good. But being at this place was a mighty shaping influence for both of us, and when the airplane lands in San Antonio, it's amazing. It feels like I think I've just come home. Even though I've been a lot of places like Spokane in between, and Austin in between, and Colorado Springs in between, the deepest, longest relationships in ministry, you know, really are sustained from here. But this is a complicated time in the church. So what do you notice in that picture? What just immediately jumps out at you? A lot of empty seats. A lot of empty seats.
Gray hair.
A lot of what we call wood is evident. You can see the pews. So Sarah's church is not unlike this one. It seats more people than First Pres San Antonio seats. It seats 800 people in the sanctuary. Has a balcony, a wraparound balcony. And there are normally, now she's up to about 65 in worship. So 65 people in 800 seats has a lot of wood. And the seats there are the very old-fashioned box seats that you think of at a baseball game. These are really box seats. So I can't just nuzzle up to Katie and get close to her on a pew as a visitor. You know, there's going to be wood and doors in between, and it's like, don't you come across that line. And so it's very hard to ever feel intimate in a sanctuary with boxes from the 1740s. So let me remind you of a story I've told some of you before. It was June the 6th, 1946, Brooklyn, New York, Prospect Park. Wonderful, lovely park. And there is a parade going on. The parade has 90,000 school children. Now, June the 6th should ring a little bell. Something famous happened on June the 6th, 1944. D-Day. But this parade had nothing to do with D-Day. Nothing to do with D-Day at all. We hadn't really figured out that that had been that important of a day at that moment. Looking back, we see it was incredibly important. The governor of New York was on the reviewing stand for this parade. The mayor of Brooklyn, of course, and a United States Supreme Court justice, one of the 9, was on this reviewing stand. June the 6th in New York schools is not summertime. It is still school time. They don't get out until about the 20th of June there. So it's a Thursday when this parade went on, and all the schools let all the children out from school to go to this event, which happened annually, and which was attended by not only 90,000 school children, but you can imagine their parents, their mothers, somebody had to get them there and get them all dressed up because they were all dressed up. And it was simply the 117th annual Sunday school parade. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. What's different? They did this every year in Brooklyn. They did it every year until about 1972, when finally there was nobody left to come. What can you not imagine from the story I just told you? Do you get Supreme Court justices watching Sunday school parades now? No government at all. Could you get 90,000 children for such a thing? In Atlanta, on a school day. All the schools let all the kids, and you know, Brooklyn has a large Jewish population. They all got out of school too. Some of them came to the parade. Different world. But when you look at church history, American church history, the highest membership, the highest attendance was in the 1950s. It had never been that high before. It has never been that high since. In fact, it was 1960 that was the peak year. Here.
Are you talking about percent of the population or raw numbers?
Both. Both. 60% were members, 69% were members, 60% were there on a regular basis in worship. So that's raw numbers most, and that's percentages highest. And the culture and the church were deeply, deeply related in ways that you would call an American version of Christendom. Prayer in the public schools until 1962, biblical literacy in the culture, so that when Steinbeck would write about East of Eden, people had a picture of what that was. When you would read handwriting on the wall, you knew that came from Daniel. There was a great sense of, Faulkner wrote a book on Absalom, you know, there was just a common usage of biblical phrases. Prayer was at public events. You know, 1984, do you remember where I was in 1984? I was here. And do you remember one of my little side jobs as the pastor of evangelism? I was the chaplain of the San Antonio Gunslingers. Okay, so think about it. On Easter Sunday of 1984, I was asked to pray over at the Breckenridge Stadium, whatever we call that, Alamo Stadium, and they were playing on Easter Sunday. I said a prayer over the whole PA for a professional football game, and Clinton Mangus, who was kind of a snake in many ways, do I hear an amen? He actually had painted on the field at the 50-yard line that emblem of the San Antonio Gunslinger, which remember was real skinny kind of guy. His handles on his guns were bigger than his waist, and you know, he was painted in the middle of the field. And then do you remember in the circle around this scraggly gunslinger who was consorting with bar saloon kind of cheerleaders was literally painted in the middle of the field, John 3:16. It was not held up on a sign by a man with a rainbow afro in the end zone. Mangus painted it on the middle of the 50-yard line all around the little gunslinger. Now again, that's a world we don't remember. It was also in those 80s, and I was here, and I was kind of marveling that nobody was fussing about it much, but that was the time in Texas when we voted out the blue laws, which meant Martha Maynard had to start working on Sunday because you were at North Star Mall, and they decided to be open like at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Prior to that, nothing. Nothing. I just drove a few weeks ago through Bergen County, New Jersey, which is just across from Manhattan. And in Bergen County, they still got blue laws. Nothing except restaurants are open on Sunday there, and they do more business in 6 days than every surrounding county does in 7. It's just curious. It's just curious. But affirming a church connection, a church tie, was very important for any office of public service. And every year there was a little statistical analysis about how many Presbyterians were in the House of Representatives, and we always were in first place. You put the inauguration, hand on a Bible, and so American culture has been deeply integrated with faith and culture, and that always gave the church what you call a home field advantage. We were an accepted part of the culture. But now as we sit in 2017, that world is not coming back, neither is Woolworths. You know, it's just a world that has rather effectively been dismantled around us. And it's happened on our watch in the church, and it's happened on your watch at First Presbyterian San Antonio, and that makes everything the church does now a little more complicated. It wasn't that hard to get a church to grow in the 90s. Even a fool like me could do it. You just kind of add water and stir. If you were not just alienating, people would come. And so the first church I pastored in Spokane, Washington, went from 2 services to 4 services. And went from about 400 in worship to about 1,200 in worship. And there was a lot going on. When I pastored the church in Colorado Springs, it was 20 years later than that, and everything, or nearly 20, and everything had changed. And suddenly I was working harder than I've ever worked for the church to almost stay even, but not growing exponentially. Is that world coming back? Well, options that we always have when we find some distasteful notion or thought is that we can follow the river in Egypt called denial, and we will just sail down it. This is not happening. And if it happens, it is happening because some malevolent force has caused this, and we'll get rid of them, and then it's going to be okay. In fact, one of the things that has always worried me about the eco movement I helped to start is that churches assume if we just got out of the Peace USA, then we would grow and flourish again. It's not the case. That's a great starter piece, but many, many other things. The second option many of us feel like is we got to go get that world back. And we got to do whatever we can do to have that world reemerge. Christendom had its downsides in it too. There was more nominalism in that world. But we kind of want that central place in culture back. Or we can learn to adapt to ministry in this new setting and context. Jeremiah 29 is a passage about when the children of Israel were taken captive and sent off to Babylon. And they didn't want to be in Babylon. Nobody liked Babylon. One of the Psalms is kind of, 137 is kind of very sad and then mad about having to go off to Babylon. And it starts off, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and cried when we remembered Zion. And our captors wanted us to sing one of the songs of Zion, but how can we sing King Alpha's song in a strange land? They wanted to go home. They wanted to go home quick. So they just kind of got in denial and said, this is not happening, and we're going to go back. We're going to get there quickly. And it was Jeremiah's letter that had to tell them, settle down, build houses, plant gardens, give your children in marriage, and seek the welfare of the city to which you've been called. So part of what the North American church is having to do is almost change Old Testament paradigms. Because most of us have thought we have gotten out of bondage, we are on our way to the promised land, a little trouble in between, but we're going to get to a land flowing with milk and honey where all the Canaanites are gone, and we're going to rule the land, and it's going to be great. And that's the driving force of what the Puritans in the neighborhood where I live in, that's what they expected. They couldn't pull it off in England. So the Puritans, 30,000 of them came from 1630 to 1640 to establish New England as a city set on a hill. And they were going to rename everything over there and make it something new. So there is a Presbyterian church in New London, Connecticut, and there's another one in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and Cambridge was chosen as the name. We think of it now with Harvard, but that was chosen because it was Cambridge where the Reformation really took hold in England. And we're going to get that Exodus experience here. And that's what drove American expansion, was that we were going to be a city set on a hill. And we were going to show the rest of the world what it was like to be a Christian nation. And under our own feet, that's all changed. And a number of people are saying, determined, we're going to get it back. We're going to do something, we're going to vote and get it back, or we're going to revive and get it back, or we're going to teach and get it back. Well, we may have to learn to live in a different context. My Chinese students have no assumptions that they will ever rule China. They have made no alliance with the Communist Party. They don't want to take any favors the Communist Party would give them. The Communist Party never allows a gathering of Christians in China to get more than 200. So anytime they grow too big, you got to break it up. There are churches in China that have more than 1 million members in them. More than 1 million members, and they've never seen each other. They have a head pastor that nobody's ever met, because he spends all his time training the elders that run those churches all over the country. And they're trying to figure out what to do now. They're coming to seminary and they go, wow, this is going to be weird, because we've all done our ministry while we've done something else, and now they're stepping into a different world. But they don't have an assumption that they're going to take over China, and yet there will be more Christians in China in 2050 than there are here. So we are a Christian nation, right, of 350,000 congregations. And we are. We've got 350,000 congregations. Each year we close about 5,000 of those. Each year about 5,000 church plants are started. Some of the churches that get closed are actually church plants that don't make it, but we're doing a lot in that front. 80% of Americans say that they're sure there is a God and they belong to some faith group. Could be Hindu, could be Islamic, could be Christian, but 75% of America still identifies themselves as Christian. That's an interesting figure given what I just told you. 75% will still say, yeah, I'm a Christian. 65% claim an affiliation with a congregation. Interesting. We can only find 49% of them with a congregation claim. And in that middle earth would actually be our current president, who claims to be a Presbyterian, and we have checked every role, and he's never joined a single Presbyterian church, but claims to be a Presbyterian. So 49% are claimed as adherents. So we found their names on somebody's roll. 40% tell surveys that they attend worship weekly. Were you here last Sunday? Oh, yeah. Are you sure? We got up to go. We were going to go, and then it started raining. But yet we were theoretically there. Then we watched on the internet or something. We were there. But when you actually do exit polls from churches, a little less than 20% are actually there. So we have this halo factor around. We think we're there. How many are involved? Are we a Christian nation? Churchlessness is on the rise. In the 90s it was 30%, then it moved to 33%. Now in a scant 14 years it's now 43%. If you want to add those up, the de-churched and the purely unchurched are 43% of Americans. The church, 49% are on a roll, and they tend to come about once a month. 8% are very minimally involved, very infrequent. That number used to be larger, but it's moved into the de-church category. So they come Christmas and Easter, or they alternate. Poinsettias one year, Easter lilies the next. They don't like the redundancy of the same flower in church every time they come. So they want to get off a year, and then it's kind of newer. But that would tell you there's a job to be done. But it also tells you, when you start adding up those percentages into real numbers, that means that since September of last year, 100 million plus Americans have not been to church. 100 million people is a huge mission field. A huge mission field. There are a lot of regional differences in church attendance. This is a map showing every county in the United States. The blue areas are the least churched parts of the country, where less than 35% are related to a church. The yellow areas are the most churched area, where more than 75% are churched. You can see that the Northwest and the Northeast would be two of the least churched areas. The southwest corner of Florida is in the blue. The coal mining country of eastern Kentucky, southern Ohio, and much of West Virginia is in that blue picture, which is kind of unusual. If you blow up the map a little bit and you want to see Texas, you can see that actually Austin is that blue county. That's where they are. And Comal County is a red one, and I think you're a red one, but you're not a yellow county either. You're kind of right in the middle. The red ones are the middle version that are between 45 and 55%. So there's a lot of work to be done in this country, and very unevenly. Even a place like South Carolina, Bob, has a blue area around Charleston, and another blue area in Georgia right around Savannah. So interesting the way this is mixed, and this is a pretty recent study that has been done through Hartford Seminary. When you begin to look at, though, where is the problem in this? The problem is really generational. And it's where you begin to uncover what the challenge is, because anybody who is a builder generation person, born prior to 46, and I think Skates is the only one of those in here, they tend to say, in answer to the question, are you part of a church? 74% say, yeah, I am. Now, everybody in that generation is 71 and above, and that actually, when you study Presbyterians around the country, that's the core of our constituency. And has been for a number of years. The baby boomers grew up in that church, left, some of them came back. And what Ron and I were seeing when I was here with him in the 80s is what we were seeing were baby boomers coming back to church through certain ways of doing ministry. And some of them had taken a vacation from God during college, and something brought them back, and often it was either the relationship and the community they found among peers, or it was that we have a baby that needs to get baptized, and what hoop do we have to go through to get that done? And so those were drivers. What's curious is that Gen Xers, between 65 and 82, Katie Zabinin is probably in that, are you? 65, first year of them. That group is only church that, are you part of a church? That's the only question this is asked. Are you part of a church? Just 27%. The millennials still have 1 year of them, which most of them would be seniors in high school. Then we've got a bunch in college, and then I'm teaching mostly millennials. That's most of who I teach now in seminary. That number is looking like it's going to be slightly less than 20%. We're waiting until the last group gets out of high school. Usually, actually, kids leave the church when they get car keys. So it's not necessarily going off to college. But estimate is going to be 19-point-something% of millennials. Now that should answer a lot of questions about why many churches are struggling. Because it's not that every region of the country is suffering, and it's not that every age cohort is suffering. There are particular ones. And that means, what are we going to do about that? Now, you're not in the PCUSA anymore, so you can just kind of smile at this. But you are bringing PCUSA cooties with you, meaning that trends that we have long practiced and long been involved in don't get out of you that quick. You can always take the Israelites out of Egypt. It's really hard to get Egypt out of the Israelites. And I am still actually in the PCUSA, and so is Sarah. That's a PCUSA church, but we live in both worlds, and I'm in mostly eco churches to talk. But now the membership is 1.4 million. When I landed here and was ordained in 1983, it was over 3 million. So now it's that. And so you can see that the number of congregations is now well under 10,000. The membership has rapidly dropped off. The census keeps going up, so there are more people in the country. You would think all ships would rise in the harbor. They're not. So we used to have 4.5 million in 65. Now we got less than 1.5 in 15 and 16. We used to be 2.2% of the population. Now we're 0.4% of the population. And we're the second oldest denomination in terms of the ages of our members, because we are filled with that cohort that are the builder generation. So that's where a lot of our folks are existing. And if you want to know, for a fee, I'll tell you the oldest denomination in North America that has the oldest members. Okay, there's no, you don't want to know. Oh, you do want to know? Okay, it's the PCA. The PCA are 59 and a half because they broke off of the Southern Presbyterian Church in the 70s, and their core fiery bucks, even though a lot of them are young, the core constituency is a little older. Now, we've got a lot of congregations that have left. Yours was one of them. Which year did you technically leave? 15? So you're one of that 104. But that's 500 plus nearly 600 congregations have left in these last few years. And we've dissolved a whole lot of, almost 500 dissolved in that same period of time that have just run out of members. 90% of Presbyterian congregations in the PCUSA have reached a plateau or are declining. There are only 10% of them were showing any kind of growth, and really almost 2 handfuls were showing remarkable growth of more than 5% in a year for several years in a row. Very, very few. Now, all congregations and all denominations go through life cycles. You have a growth spurt, a birth spurt, a growth spurt. Things are going well. You were in a long growth spurt here for a while, and then you hit this little plateau. And plateau is the easiest church to manage because you're finally staffed to deal with the number of people you have. But if not careful, then you begin to go down that decline, and I work in church revitalization, so we try to analyze which of the 3 decline points are you on. Many of you who work in business would do the same thing with any business. You would know that there is a growth period, a stability period. When you get to decline, you have to go, why? So far, the PCUSA has never sent out a blue ribbon committee to understand why this is happening. And they just, every year, their report on the statistics is the most denial-oriented report I've ever read in my life. We didn't decline as much last year. We only lost 82,000. The year before, we lost 85,000, which is the same percentage or more than we used to lose. We just had fewer Presbyterians to lose. But you have to figure out 3 different strategies of whether you redefine, redevelop, have a rebirth. Sarah's congregation was really down in this 3rd level, right there in the level before death. And so she's getting a chance to see a rebirth of a congregation. Now, some other groups are growing, or at least were. The Southern Baptists are now not, but they were. But the Assemblies of God are one of the most fascinating stories we've got because they actually just started in, you could say, 1904 at the Azusa Street Revival. And they're now at the 3 million number we used to be, and they just keep plowing forward, and worldwide much larger than that. And so you want to know why. So for the PCUSA numbers, I got 4 reasons, and I'm telling you these 4 reasons because these 4 reasons are going to linger with you because this is where you've been, and just because you got a new uniform and a new lapel button, I'm noticing Bob is wearing it, that doesn't mean that these things somehow miraculously stop. So our biggest problem, our constant, is we can't find and keep young adults. That's just our perennial issue. We just have an amazing ability to scare them off. And you see that through baptism numbers. I've shown some of you baptism numbers before, but they just continue to plummet. See, we were baptizing 33,000 in 2004 and now 13,000. There would be no more alarming number than that one. And it's never been written about. Because you just go, wow, that's just shocking. The year I landed here, 1983, the year of reunion, we baptized 50,000. 13,000 now. We also are a denomination that believes in confirmation. We believe in putting these children in Sunday school, helping them all along. Confirm means to make hard or to make firm what has been kind of jello-y in their life, to put the jello in the freezer and finally get it hard. And yet, if you baptized 50,000 in 1983, about 1997 you would expect to see 50,000. Maybe a few more would have added along the way. But we lost 40% of our kids by the time they got to confirmation, never got through it. Now, obviously, some moved to other places, others moved in, but What this tells you is that the families who brought their babies for baptism did not stay here long enough to get them confirmed. And that's not a child issue. Usually a child is not driving the family home. Usually the parents are taking the children home. And again, professions of faith in 1997 were 31,000. You would have expected, but only 11,000 professions of faith in 2015. So, to drill it down, fewer young adults here, fewer children baptized, fewer children retained until confirmation. That was the church I grew up in Oklahoma City. This was dazzling little me in the choir with my bow, and I'm singing so powerfully that the girls are actually shocked into silence. I'm the only one singing, I want you to know. Karen Campbell and Sheila Hapke. That church has now closed their Christian education wing, which was built in my childhood, where we had 35 fifth graders when I was in 5th grade. And it's now closed because they don't have a single child in the church now. It was a 1,300 member church, not a single one. So, let's just do a moment of elder discussion. Implications for First Pres. What would drive us to be different? What are we willing to do to reach and retain young adults? In fact, how are we doing at First Pres with that cohort now? Are we seeing scads and droves? Teresa says yes.
Oh, no, well, I'm on the search committee to bring our new young adult pastor here, and I'm looking at him because I'm hoping we were honest with him with what we had.
Is it
all
what-
on you, Mitchell.
Yeah.
Did you find it, Mitchell?
Excuse me?
Did you find what you were expecting to find?
I mean, yes and no. In honesty.
Yeah. So, usually a church has to say, how do we do this? And here is the tactical change you make to attract young adults. You hire a young adult magnet and assume that that person will bring them all in. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. Here we go rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. And you know what? That actually could work even without a magnetic person in the 80s. That could work. But it did here. That's right. That's what I meant. Had a guy that just was a little odd in every way. But you know, there had to be, in those days, you could run young adults somewhat like you ran youth ministry programs. Thinking of the head of Mickey Mouse and his ears, you could just let it be its own little world out here on the side. And if it worked, great. If it didn't work, great. But it was so nice to look at the youth group and say, isn't it wonderful that all those kids are here? And the 80s were the era of the bigger youth groups. But that's not the way it's working now. It has to have what you would call adaptive change. And adaptive change is messing with the whole system. And adaptive change means you have two competing values. We really want young adults, and we really want life to be the same way it's always been. Those are two competing values. And see, those have to sand on each other long enough until the culture would be one that doesn't scare off the young adults who finally come in. Now, you will get some. You will tend to get that percentage of young adults who are traditionalists and are willing to step into a world that seems foreign to them, but to make the whole culture where you have to go, And that's where most Presbyterian churches kind of go, is there another plan? Could we have another one? I'd like to find another one. And what you're finding now in America is the birth for the first time of what you would call age tribal churches, where there are no young adults in older traditional churches, and there are no younger adults in older traditional churches, and there are no older adults in many of the young millennial churches. I visit them because I go out to watch my students in mentored ministry. I'm the oldest one in those churches by 30 years. And I keep going, would you not want a couple of us old geezers around to at least advise? But you know, when they hand you earplugs when you walk in the door, you go, okay, I don't know if I can do this. And that's just that's a good signal to scare people like me off. Well, see, we're doing things that scare them off, just by the way it works. Now, you have adapted and worked through the issue back in the 90s when you said, let's do another service in the fellowship hall and have different music, and then we can let the Mickey Mouse happen over there, and it won't bother us over here. And that has a place. And again, with certain times and certain personalities, that can work pretty well. I did it in Colorado. I did it in all three places I was. Spokane and Austin and Colorado Springs. But somehow, the whole church has not swallowed the project. And it's isolated to a place. And I think we have not quite gotten to what you would call adaptive change. And adaptive change is where the church itself begins to let its whole identity. Churches are notorious for not asking why. You know, you can hardly go to McDonald's anymore without them asking you to fill out a survey. And you know, McDonald's is about the same every time. They don't have that much variation between the nasty pickles that are on their hamburgers. They're pretty nasty every time, in my opinion, and those little bitty onions. So I write it down but there's a lot of variation in churches. And what churches rarely do is actually ask, why did you find it that you only wanted to be here 1 week and then not come back? And you know why we don't ask? Because most of us who are pastors are afraid that the survey is going to come back, we didn't like the pastor. And we would actually rather not know that than to actually face the truth. And maybe we will have to adapt as well. So why does all of the world do exit surveys and the church never does? We don't get their credit card often, so harder to track them down. And then when you begin to look at adaptive change, you realize Sunday mornings have really become way more complicated. In those same 1950s I was showing you before, in 1946, you realize no competition on Sunday mornings was probably the marker of what allowed the church to thrive so much. I mean, if the only thing to do was weed the garden or go to church, I think I'll go to church. I mean, there wasn't even much good TV. I mean, Davy and Goliath was on Sunday morning, but that couldn't hold you all morning. And Face the Nation, okay, maybe. But, you know, now the proliferation of competition for Sunday mornings is just vivid. We don't live in the promised land anymore, where they've carved us out space. So, spending time in Cairo, Qasr al-Dabar Church is a Presbyterian church. And let's just think about Egypt for a minute. Does Sunday have a sacred, set-apart nature in Egypt? The answer is supposed to be no. Does Sunday have a sacred, set-apart nature in Egypt? No. Okay. So, that's a work day in Egypt. So if you're going to be a Christian church, are you going to put all your eggs in the basket of Sunday morning? Because that's the Lord's day. Probably would not be a good idea in Egypt. The only people you will get will be people who are retired or preschoolers. So when is the best time in Egypt if you're going to offer a service of worship that would fit naturally into the holy days that are present and are there to sustain the Islamic faith in Egypt?
Right.
Fridays. Friday nights in particular. Now that just doesn't seem right to a church. Friday service. But that's an adaptation to a missional context. So the largest service that happens in Qasr al-Dabar is on Friday night. They also have one during the daytime on Friday. Sunday they have a service of worship. And some people come, not many. But they've decided to adapt because they know that the craziness of life in Egypt is such that they actually have a service of worship 7 nights a week. Every night of the week, there is a service of worship so that everybody could find one of them that their work would let them come to, because they actually don't have enough room for everybody on Friday. Seats about 1,200 in that sanctuary, but they have, it's the most used building space of any church you'll ever meet, because some of those days they have 2 services. Again, that's adaptive change. It's saying, 11 o'clock on Sunday, that was prime hour, not now. Now there is, again, an organization called the National Baptist Church Sunday. Did you know that? They put out bulletin inserts. This is the one. In fact, I think it's this Sunday. It's usually the 3rd or 4th Sunday of September, about the 20th of September. And you can get all the flyers, and they're coming back, but they're not. So, second big thing, professions of faith are way down from where they used to be, meaning we are not reaching unreached people with new professions of faith. Point number 1, young adults, you could just be stealing other people's young adults. But to find people who are making professions of faith, way down. Old question on the narrative state of religion. Have there been any special manifestations of the Holy Spirit's power in your church by conversion or increased church work? We've adopted that sentence into the eco statement so that we need, okay, where is God at work? If you look at these numbers, which I've shown some of you before, you look that the adult baptisms in 1925 were double what the infant baptisms were in 1925 in an infant baptizing church. That meant we're reaching unreached people. That number stayed positive for adult baptisms until 1952 or 3. And then it flipped, and infant baptism started overwhelming adult baptism, such that now it's about a 3-to-1 ratio on infant to adult. We're just not reaching adult non-believers. 2,775 in the PCUSA. Now, one of our goals in ECO is to baptize more people than we bury. And I think we're getting close. But to have a sustained reaching of unreached peoples that would come to baptism is very complicated. So Martha Grace Reese has done an exhaustive study of 30,000 congregations. She was looking for a church that would be baptizing 1% of their worship attendance. So I think Ron told me at lunch that we're at about 600 people in worship on a Sunday here. Is that number about right? So that would mean you would do 6 adult baptisms every year. And Martha Grace Reese was looking for, could I find any congregations doing that 5 years in a row, so that it's not just an episodic thing, but we've got a sustained pattern. And 1% is not much to aim for. But out of 30,000 congregations, she could only find 150 that met that criteria. Somehow we've forgotten how to do this. Is First Pres still reaching lost people? I brought a book with me today that I require my students to read. It's about evangelism in the early church, the patient ferment of the early church. The first 3 centuries were remarkable, but they were remarkable mostly because it was the fastest growing period of the church, and there was not a single book written on how to do evangelism. We have not found any books in the ancient literature that were training manuals for doing evangelism, and yet more people did it than ever before. And they did it mostly not through pastors. And they didn't do it through coming to church. They wouldn't actually let you come to church until you had made a profession of faith and gone through a 3-year catechetical process. So this was all done relationally and all done in house churches. And then, okay, third thing is huge problem with all Presbyterian churches with the back door. People going inactive. If you look at how you leave a Presbyterian church, you either transfer your letter to another place, or you die, or you go to the other category. Meaning we just dropped you from the roll. And sessions are always having to do that. You know, where are Carol and David West? He said, we haven't seen them in weeks. So again, all in favor of dropping them from the roll. You know, and you're not supposed to come for a year or give any money for a year. And if you don't for 2 or 3 years in a row, we finally get around. Usually when a new pastor comes along, we kind of get there. Or when you're about to leave the denomination and you want to pay less per capita, then you start carrying the roll. But that becomes a big Presbyterian problem. If you look at the inactive list since 1983, we've actually put 3 million people on it. 3 million people. That would be everybody at one level. We've added some new ones. And so if they have limited connections only with the senior pastor, or only with an associate pastor, or a staff person, or only with parents in the youth ministry, when youth ministry is over, sometimes they leave. Or when the pastor leaves, they leave. The connection wasn't big. So there are a lot of implications you can think of from the back door. New church development, final one. PCUSA is still just starting about 17 new churches a year. ECO is going to hit that number probably a year after next. With only 350 churches, they will already exceed that number. But you just can't live starting 17 and stopping 97. But that DNA has been in us. You've given it one great try out north, and now you're involved in another one. And that question on the narrative on the state of religion, how are you establishing your church beyond its bounds, has been part of our core DNA that got forgotten. So all of these are the picture of how this has been happening and why this has been happening. And so I like to quote, I think, the patron saint of the PCUSA, this little Bo Peep, because I think this has been our mantra. So I want you to say it with me. The words are up there. You knew this as a child. Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and can't tell where to find them. Strategy, leave them alone and they'll come home and bring their tails behind them. This is our strategy. This has been what we've done the entire 35 years I've been ordained. They'll be back. They'll be back. And so far, it hasn't worked. So what do? Well, today's problems usually came from yesterday's solutions, and so we got to begin to think about, is there another way to be? Are young adults living in San Antonio? It's actually a remarkably young town from what I'm told. What would you think they would appreciate about a Presbyterian church? And what might slow them down? Somebody told me they're building 18,000 apartments within a few blocks of the church downtown. Is this true or myth? Mostly true.
Within a mile.
What's that?
Within a mile or two.
Within a mile or two. So unchurched people, de-churched people, they are unlikely today to show up. An unchurched person is a person who's never been. They're usually coming from some other faith tradition or no faith tradition. And they don't just sit on the back row. The thing that is most staggering when you analyze churches is that in the 80s, when I was here, we had a huge visitor stream every single week. We had those little sign-in pads. I was the one who read those sign-in pads every week. I made a determination of how we respond, who we call, how we visit. I visited a lot of those people. I called many of those people on Sunday afternoon. The visitor traffic was, and certainly in Colorado Springs when I was there, we would often have 100 to 150 visitors every week. Some of those were out-of-town people, Texans coming up to flee the summer, but some of those were even the cases would sign that occasionally, but sometimes those would be people who were church, what's the verb that goes with that? Shopping. Looking for a church. Every study of churches today, that number of visitors orbiting through is less than half of what it was 30 years ago. Millennials do not shop for churches. They're either in or they're out, and if they're out, they can hardly imagine getting up on Sunday morning and going alone to a place they've never been before. They just don't do it. So they're going to have to be met somewhere other than at the back door of this church. Now you happen to have social surface and you're meeting these people. They live near you, they work around you, they work for you. Cox & Smith probably has a bunch of young, billable hour kinds of young attorneys that we're trying to get going. They're there. But are we ready not to invite them to church because they're going to go, I don't think so. We're going to have to first tell them about Jesus. And then maybe they will get to church. So that means creating a way of being that we haven't been before. We haven't been that way before. Not since the early church, right? And that's a competing value, because most of us think we are Presbyterian because we like to look like normal, sophisticated people who don't make people uncomfortable by asking them, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you would go? All right, we did. You're never going to turn a Presbyterian into that. But oddly enough, that's not the way Jesus did evangelism. And we could begin to explore that. And he would ask people, what are you looking for? Would you like to be whole? Are you able to see your life well? He's asking these guys. Did you know Jesus asked 278 questions in the gospel? And he only answered 3 of them. But Jesus is the most artful question asker you've got. In fact, the first question in the Bible may be the question I use in evangelism more than any other question. Adam, where are you? Where are you spiritually? Where are you in your life? Where are you in what you set out to do? Amazing questions. So I make every student I teach evangelism write letters, 2-page letters to unbelieving friends explaining aspects of the gospel and engaging them in conversation. And some of my students at seminary say, I don't know a non-Christian. I don't know anybody I could send such a letter to, because they've gone to Christian schools, and they've gone to Moody Bible College, and they come to Gordon Conwell. I go, well, go meet the lady that works at the cleaners, because you get to start. And you want me to write her a letter? I do. I do. Adaptive change means we want to look sophisticated. And we're beginning to come to the realization we might be the only one that is going to be able to share Jesus at the San Antonio rodeo. That might be Martha Maynard's job. We want to be well thought of, and now we're going to have to risk looking a little foolish and changing the relationship. So it's a big undertaking for any church. Closing the back door means we increase relational vitality, spiritual vitality. We make it really hard for anybody to ever leave us because they just love us, and we love them. And so there's a pastor in West Virginia who's sitting on the front porch visiting somebody in the church, and the dog is sitting on the front porch with them while they're having this visit. And the dog is whining. And it's kind of a pitiful whine. It's just lying there whining. Goes on about 5 minutes, and finally the pastor says, "Sir, what's wrong with your dog?" Yes, not much. It's just lying on a nail. and it hurts him enough to whine, but it doesn't hurt him enough to move. And again, I think we kind of have to wrestle with, is that us? This is bugging us? So let's go back to Little Bo Peep. Is that the end of the story? Let's look at verse 2. What you say, verse 2? Little Bo Peep fell fast asleep and dreamt she heard them bleating. But when she awoke, she found it a joke, for they were still all asleep. Okay, so she thought, I think I'm hearing young adults come back into church. I think I hear new believers receiving Jesus and coming back into the church. Oh, that was a dream. Oh, dear. So do we go back to plan B? Leave them alone and they'll come home? Verse 3. Say it with me. Then up she took her little crook, determined for to find it. She found them indeed, but it made her heart bleed, for they had left their tails behind. So she got out and did it, and she found they had been wounded by living apart from the people of God, so to speak. So, part of what I'll be doing in a sermon tomorrow is seeing if we can't get that crook back in our hand. All right, so let's pause right there. What's the most discouraging thing you've heard? And what's the most hopeful thing you've heard? And what behavior could you imagine we could do that would impact any of these issues? So Lady Ray, you get Lady Ray Romano. Used to be Lady Ray. You get to go first with any of those 3 questions. Pick a question.
Well, I don't usually start this way, but the most discouraging was numbers of baptisms that are down.
Huge. Huge. Mike Monroe, what question do you want to
I'd like to
to hear more of what people would say. The question number 3 there, behavior would change in your congregation to impact this issue.
Let's let it happen. And let me give you 3 little words. Behavior is always related to values, because we tend to do what we value. And values come out of beliefs. And so typically, every Presbyterian church says, we believe in evangelism. We really do. I mean, some don't, but most do. This one has. This one actually called a pastor of evangelism a lot of years ago. That's kind of weird. But most of us believe that Louis Sabendon would do the evangelism, and we'd watch him, and we'd cheer him on, and that'd be great. And every time he talks about Jesus, it was like we put money in the plate, and we help that, and that's good. But that's what's changed, is that now that behavior has to come out of a value of, oh, that's my job, too. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Can't look sophisticated and do that. It's going to be really hard. Right, Teresa, what's one question you want to answer?
Well, 3. And maybe that's the hopeful part also too, that, you know, if we can be more like Jesus, if we can build relationships with people, earn their trust, then we can tell them about Jesus. That's a lot of work.
Could be. Could be. And again, none of us have to reach all of San Antonio. We just have to reach the little social circle God's called us to. So I was in a church in Charlotte 2 weeks ago, and the pastor had challenged them the week before. Could you just let 2 names of unreached people sit on your heart? Just 2. Just 2. Not 20, not 15, 2. And could you begin to pray for those 2 people every day for some period of time? And then think about a conversation you could start naturally with them that would just be 1 step down the road, and then a second step. So that's a behavior that's bite-sized, not overwhelming. Everybody take 2 and just think about it. Now, you don't want them to be projects. Millennials can smell out if you're a project and that you're trying to ambush me. It's got to be a genuine love and care about their lives. And one of the friends I work with says that the average person who receives Christ has heard the gospel 9 different times from 5 different people before they believe. So we're in the process, even though we may not see the end of that process. We're just playing this little bitty role somewhere, but it happens not when you make outlandish statements, but when you ask questions. And when you care enough to even have them in their house. So Sarah and I have been, we're in a neighborhood where nobody goes to church. No cars move on Sunday morning. None. Ours, the only one. So we've spent the last 4 years inviting people into our backyard 2 or 3 times a year for barbecue, ice cream, socials, various things, just trying to be a presence among our neighbors. And they don't want to, you know, the minute we tell them I teach at Gordon Conwell, or Sarah's a pastor, they just kind of cringe. And so we can't go line and ambush. We're going to get you. We're going to get you. So it's taken us 4 years of backyard barbecues. And finally, the last time we had them was the first time, which was about the 10th time we had them in our home, that they started asking questions about anything related to faith. But it's now starting. But it takes a long time. The batting average goes through. All right, somebody else. Sherry McCann, what question do you want to answer?
Well, actually, what you just said, what Dad was most hopeful to hear in terms of some positive signs, we all know the negative side. We've endured it for
Yeah, your whole time.
a lot of years.
Yeah.
Just that it is my responsibility and every individual's responsibility.
And that's a doable plan. And that's what the early church did. They assumed that all of them were called to be missionaries. And that's what the whole missional church model is it's beginning to realize the church is no longer the magnet that draws people here. It's the mission equipping station for us to go out there. That's just a different model. But once we get it, and once we realize, you know, one of my parishioners in Austin's father was an orthodontist at Highland Park in Dallas, Alexander, Wick Alexander's father, Moody. He loved sharing, and he had a captive audience with junior high kids. And he was a remarkable evangelist. Didn't lead them all to Christ. Stirred them up though. And was able to talk about the hope that lies within him, and didn't do it in an offensive way, but in a winsome way. So, there's a thought. All right, take a 5-minute wiggle break, and we'll come back for a little second piece where I'm going to show you one other tangible thing that we could think about doing that would make a big difference. I've been talking about Christendom. And Christendom is basically an assumption that there is a wedding between the culture and the society around us, and that there's a certain expectation that you will, in fact, come to church for sometimes reasons that are other than to worship God. So right when I got here, 1983, is Jack Poole still around? Haven't seen him in a while. Well, Jack came up to me and said, you know, the last lecture in dental school was that we needed to join a church to find clients. So I came here for that, and then when he got here, he actually, in spite of Ron, he found Jesus. So it was a great, so a Christendom church is that. And, you know, I'll show you one little fun little slide that right here. In God we trust on currency. It got on coins in 1864, got on currency in 1957. Can you imagine what the discussion would be like today if we were trying to put it on something? And in fact, the discussion has started to take it off. So we're still in this unraveling process of separating from Christendom. You know, many churches in Virginia this year got tax bills for property tax that they were not required to pay, but it just sort of alarmed them, because this is what you would be paying if your property were taxed. And they go, why are you sending that unless there is some plan some year to finally do that? And there probably is. I mean, at one level you got to say, why do we get exempted from paying property tax? In New England, a new church cannot build a new building and get tax exemption for it, because the towns of New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont do not want to set apart another piece of property on which taxes are not paid. So an existing building is pretty much their only option in many places, or staying in high school. So we just got to come to realize that this whole parking lot across the street and this square block, one day, I think Texas will be last to do this kind of thing. I think New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, the blue areas will be quick to do it. So we've got a lot of things going on that have been going on with Christendom. What has put a layer on top of Christendom is what we call the attractional church. And the attractional church has been the assumption that we've got to make this church very attractive so people will drive by other churches to get here. McDonald's, you know, they started out selling a 15-cent hamburger, and I've already mentioned it once, but the same ingredients were on that 15-cent hamburger every time you got it. And they were ketchup with little bitty, tiny chopped up onions embedded in ketchup, and 2 pickles sitting on top of the hamburger. And that's what you got every time. And if you wanted something different, it gave them apoplexy, because they couldn't whip them out very fast if they did that. And so they would give it to you and say, you fix it. So I would have to bring French's mustard, which is what I thought belonged on a hamburger, with me. And I would have to do surgery on this hamburger, and I'd have to scrape the bun to get that ketchup and embedded onions off. There wasn't much left of the bun after that. And then I would have to take a napkin and dab all the pickle juice off of the hamburger, because I hate pickle juice. And then I would cover it with mustard, and then it was kind of redeemed. And then Burger King came out. Will you sing it with me? Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. All we ask is that you let us serve you today. Have it your way. It's such a good commercial. Now, again, I do this often with millennials present, and they're just horrified that we all knew the song. It just freaks them out. Mitchell might be horrified now, and he's a Gen Xer, I think. But hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special order, have it your way. That's consumerism. That's the ability to say, okay, you don't have to have it this way. Let's make it another way. Hold the organ, hold the choir. Collar and tabs are not required. All we ask is that you... So, consumerism goes to church, 70s, 80s, 90s. Parachurch was influential. Young Life was getting so many kids, and we were duds, and how do we do this? And so Saddleback, Willow Creek, Calvary Chapel, they all got the boomers coming back to church who wanted something different. Now again, when you were in the farmer culture, prior to World War II, and you wore overalls all week long, you actually wanted to wear your Sunday best on Sunday to show everybody you weren't just a dumb farmer. But when you're wearing your Sunday best 5 days a week, or sometimes 6 days a week at the bank, you really don't want to do it again on Sunday. You would rather come in Dockers or something. So a lot of these changes are reactions to culture. And so the boomers came back. They made it onto Time Magazine. We didn't all come back, but a lot came back. And they came back to something that was different. Worship had a different energy. Preaching had a different accessibility. Personality drove a lot of it. Functional buildings drove a lot of it. A lot of programs so that you could find something for every little itch you could scratch. And they had to be well managed with a great staff, and you'd drive past 7 and put an enormous pressure on the preaching pastor because you couldn't be bad really 2 weeks in a row. Something for everybody in these. Lots of management issues, but suddenly we start talking about vision and mission and focus. And these churches had a great run in the 80s and 90s because they were the ones getting the baby boomers back. And baby boomers didn't mind going to big places like where Max Lucado was pastoring because they'd gone to big high schools and big universities. And they preached on things that just seemed real and have video clips and no manuscript. And it was just, wow, this is cool. But there was an unconscious wedding in that with consumerism. And if you wed yourself to consumerism, it will come back and bite you. Because one day somebody else will invent a better hamburger and more access, and you can't always have everything the best, but you try. But then something comes up down the street. I was doing really good in Austin, and then Chris Tomlin started a church 2 miles away. And I'm going, seriously? I mean, did you have to come here? We don't need you here. Go, go, go. One of the ways the basic story of the gospel has been compromised is that it's become all about us and how God is supposed to meet our needs, and we have created attractional churches that are about how God does just that. Now, God does that, but that's not the whole story of the gospel. And so attractional byproducts required lots of entrepreneurial skill, created lots of worship wars as we fought over worship and music, and a lot of building projects that if we build it, they'll come, and those have been hard. And usually we fight over why we can't sing the old songs, and the old songs to church musicians are Isaac Watts, and the old songs to your grandmother was Fanny Crosby, and the old songs to baby boomers was why can't we sing Seek Ye First anymore, and Gen Xers want to do Newsboys or something, I don't know. So a lot of our churches became what you became. And you became what I call a hybrid Christendom attractional church. And we'll run both models in 2 different rooms with a little slight overlap, and we'll try to get builders and boomers here. And you need a private chaplain and a great leader. And that's really what Lewis, in many respects, was stretched on both ends to do. And it's an amazing, I mean, I visited in the hospital. I remember at the Knicks one day, and the lady was so happy and happy to meet you, and thank you for coming. And then she said to me, when is the real pastor meeting Lewis? And I am the real pastor. So when you think about that world, there's this third option that's now emerging, and it's hard to get into. It's hard to change. And it's called the missional church. It's not a missions-minded church. Because Leslie Newbegin began asking a question, can the West be converted? Because he was a missionary in India for years, came back to Birmingham, England, and thought the whole thing had changed in the 30 years he had been gone. And now we have a post-Christian era. How are we going to reach those people? So he's got a whole content and a whole theological system that is behind all of that. But he's trying to say, how are we going to do this? A missional church is a reproducing community of authentic disciples being equipped as missionaries sent by God to live and proclaim his kingdom in their world. That's ecclesiology. That's one ecclesiological statement about what the church is supposed to be. Now that's a different statement than you and I grew up with. Because we grew up with a philosophy that said, theoretically, if you want to come sit, soak, and sour, you can. Because there are really no expectations of you. You can just sit on the back row, soak it in, and just get sour. The Sea of Galilee has a stream of water flowing into it from Mount Hermon and water flowing out of it in the Jordan River. The Dead Sea has water flowing in from the Jordan River and nothing flowing out. That's why it's dead. And so if there's nothing flowing out, we will eventually sour and become dead. But we thought, well, maybe we can just be part of a team where somebody else is doing it. But a missional church says, no, we're going to stop and create authentic disciples who are being equipped as missionaries. Now, missionaries is something we used to think of as far, far away. Remember, there are 100 million people living around you who have never been to church once. So being a missionary in San Antonio is a different identity. And one of the great hopes is to think, how would we do this? Now, I'm going to try to talk tonight about Reformation history. And I'm going to talk tomorrow noon about Reformation history. But I'm going to talk about it as a movement. And I'm going to play with you on how do movements begin? Where do they come from? Because you think, oh wait a minute, we can never become a missional church. This would be way too hard given what we're doing. Okay, this is not as hard as being a Roman Catholic church and becoming a Lutheran church. People were dying over that. I mean, this was a harder cultural shift to make. And I'm going to tell you what it required to make it. And I'm going to tell you what it would be required if we were going to make a shift to become a third kind of church. Now, you won't be able to do it exclusively. You're still going to have to do the little Christendom dance, and then you're going to have to do the attractional dance, and then you're going to have to play the missional dance. And this is a great little challenge. But a missional church, a missions-minded church, and this has always been a missions-minded church, great missions perceives a mission as one expression of its ministry. We have a committee that watches over it, and does it, and decides what to do with it. The missional church perceives mission as the essence of its existence. That the nail has gotten painful enough or compelling enough that we've gotten off of it and quit whining and started doing something. It doesn't mean to be unattractive, but it means we assume a missionary posture, and we equip members for this moment of history. And we are especially equipping people to live in the midst of the workplace. There have been very few eras, even the Reformation, which talked about the priesthood of all believers, and a firm that hunts out in the field making his hops for the later to be beer was doing God's work, never quite translated into the fullness of all that was. Now, this is what Lady Lodge has been trying to do for years, to equip you for life in the workplace. And I think this is going to be part of the Reformation that we're in the midst of right now. How do I see my work as my mission field? We will have to have a growing compassion for lost sheep. And until compassion gets ignited, as I'll say in the sermon tomorrow, it won't happen too much. We're going to have to better express kingdom of God values. That's what a missional church does. Don't we live into some things, even like justice and social compassion, which this church has been doing a long time. But the goal in the middle of that is going to have to be to make disciples. And making disciples is not something you just join a Sunday school class that happens. It becomes a very intentional activity, which I will talk about tomorrow at noon. It can happen in the preaching. It happens in the whole vision of the church. But making disciples becomes a process with an intentional aim to follow after Jesus for the flourishing of your own life and for the sake of others. So it means that you begin to change some of the byways we've been doing discipleship. The missional church would say, actually, you can be a missional church and worship in all kinds of ways. So the worship war is not at the core of the missional church movement. What's at the core of that is the function of discipleship. And it would say we do parts of discipleship and preaching, parts in large group gatherings like Sunday school classes, parts in small groups, but to do efficient discipleship, it requires a small, intimate circle where we can really talk about the issues of our lives, and it requires a multiplication of people over a 5-year period that are equipped to do that. And some churches would say maybe starting with elders, and that the role of elder would be in some ways redefined. I find this to be a hopeful prognosis for many of tomorrow's issues, because right now most of us don't want to go do evangelism and talk to people about Jesus because we're afraid that we actually don't know our faith well enough to be able to talk about it to another. And that if they ask us what about the problem of suffering and evil, we will go, oh, never mind, no, it's okay. Or the sins of the church, you're right, we had that, never mind. This would be a different, deliberate way of working with people in sometimes 1-on-3 relationships that could build them toward a purpose. So a person in an eco church in Houston has given money to equip eco churches to begin processes of discipleship. He's given money to Fuller Seminary and Gordon Conwell Seminary such that we are actually building out the discipling of seminary students, because most of our students have never been discipled. And it's unlikely they'll do it in a church if it didn't happen to them. So now I'm discipling 3 different students. We've got about 10 faculty doing this. That covers about 30. The next year, those 30 begin to work with 30 students, and it doesn't take that long to build this thing out. Discipleship is one of the core purposes of ECO. We want to build flourishing churches that make disciples for Jesus Christ. That's our tagline. Build flourishing churches that make disciples for Jesus Christ. I think this will be the piece of the next Reformation. And I think it looks like slow, but the early church, again, was the patient ferment of the early church. Instead of doing it in a rush, everybody that joined the early church went through a 3-year discipleship program before they joined. Now, this seems counterintuitive. You'd run people off in an attractional church model. But if you want to build something that lasts, you can grow a squash in about 6 months. If you want to grow an oak tree, it's going to take a while. I think we want to grow an oak tree. And again, is this a faddish thing? I don't think so, because I think that's what the Great Commission was for. Go make disciples of all nations. That was actually pretty core. And Dallas Willard calls this the elephant in the room of the Christian church. We actually haven't done it. We've made really good church members, but we haven't made them. Now that's going to create adaptive change. And it takes leadership to do adaptive change. And that leadership usually comes from elders. And it causes the church to see these are the competing values. And for culture to change, you focus on the culture, not the organization. We like to think, well, if we form a new committee on discipleship, then this will happen. No. This one is a culture issue. And a culture issue changes differently than just an organizational issue. And that means building a culture in some remarkable ways. And I won't talk about that anymore today. I'll do some more of it tomorrow. But how do you create a movement? The Reformation was not just a great idea. It was a great idea that was embedded in a culture that was rapidly changing, and the Roman Catholic Church could have never kept up with the culture that was changing because of suddenly the communication occurred. When Luther nailed up the 95 Theses on October the 31st, 1570, that would have never gone anywhere if the printing press had not been right there to take it and distribute it all over Europe so that people all read it. Jan Hus tried to do something very similar to Luther 100 years before. It didn't work. I think he got burned at the stake, died. So I think we're at a pregnant moment where God is about to do something, and the question is, can we say yes and say, let's help the culture change? Or does the drag of the culture keep us stuck where we've been? And that's a common temptation. We like to think they're coming back. Leave them alone, they'll come home. Wagging their tails back. I don't think so. So I just want to lay that before the elders as kind of a challenge and let you ask me a couple questions in response. And you'll get to hear a little more if you happen to come to the student lecture. But if you've given up already Saturday afternoon, we need to go somewhere else. Go somewhere else. Questions, comments, rebuttals, annoyances? I'm always kind of annoying. I know that. But
You know, you made a really interesting statement a little while ago about the church in Cairo, that they, you know, just in adapting to their situation, they decided to have their primary service, or their kind of one of their main focus points be Friday night. You know, we're in a changing culture, and Christianity is no longer dominant. But it seems like part of the problem is that people's schedules are getting so full that there isn't a limit. I mean, so I'm really intrigued by the idea of, okay, what if we try to spread it out? How will we do it? I mean, any thoughts about that? Anything that you're seeing working, or that maybe people are bringing to you? Is there a better time than Sunday morning?
well, Sunday mornings certainly fit some people, and will always fit some people. Anybody that's got kids in sports that require you to travel, it doesn't fit. In Ipswich, Massachusetts this year, graduation occurred at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. That's where this town, anybody got a problem with that? So the Catholics have always done Saturdays, and again, Ipswich is largely Catholic, and so they would assume they got their worship done on Saturday, we have graduation on Sunday, no big deal. I was amazed. I got here last night at 10:45, got to this hotel right over here about 11:15. I was just stunned at how many people were on the street and how many people were parked in your parking lot at 11:15 on Friday night. I mean, this is not the way it used to be in my memory. Not that I was here a lot at that hour, but I thought, wow, I didn't know San Antonio had a nightlife like that. So one of the adaptive change issues that I noticed years ago that this church was doing was you were having a lot of committee meetings at 5 and 5:30 in the afternoon to catch people who had worked downtown, like Bob Seal, on their way home, rather than assuming they had to go home and then come back. That's an adaptive change. That's saying, where are the people? So what if you got people at a different time of day? Now, I don't think traveling to First Pres at 5:30 would be much fun. I wouldn't think it was, so that might not be much fun. But I think there's some times we've got to think, what would be? And you're in a Catholic context culture. Saturdays may have a different flavor. A lot of churches have tried that. A lot of churches have tried Sunday nights. A lot of churches. So the problem with First Pres San Antonio, in my opinion, is that you've always been about 15 to 25 minutes from your nearest and dearest people. For a long time, there was no neighborhood around your church. Now, what would happen if 18,000 people are moving in here? That's bigger than the whole town I live in. And if you suddenly had 18,000 people living within a mile of the church, that suddenly changes the whole flavor. Do you really want those people to be reached? And if so, how would you fund it? Those would be fascinating strategies in my mind. And it would probably have to be through some relational networks. In fact, I would urge some of you to consider moving downtown. That's the way you do this. You build a relational network yourself. And you think like a missionary. I don't need to live in my withdrawn place. I could come right in the middle of that and start to engage. So these are the ways you begin to plan. All right, it's not for, Ron's got
All the stats you showed of different denominations, puzzles me. I come out of that.
Church is kind of a paradigm of non-relational. They don't have enough priests, so you have a priest pastoring 10,000 member churches. They don't even know it. They don't have any vision for discipleship, and yet they're growing like crazy.
Well, part of it is their RCIA, the rites of confirmation of initiation, to come in. If you joined a Roman Catholic Church tomorrow, you'd have to spend a year in a discipleship group before you got to join. And it's some great biblical teaching in that confirmation process in the Catholic Church. They are driven a lot by immigration. I mean, the church in Boston is growing for the first time in 100 years, which is a remarkable thing. But it's growing because of immigrant churches, and some of those are Catholic. So they're bringing that faith with them. And if you're Hispanic and Catholic, you would never say it's non-relational. It is relational. If you're white and Catholic, you would say it's non-relational. I mean, I went to a Catholic church in Burlington, Massachusetts. The parking lot was lined up like the Indy 500. So there were not cars parked this way. They were all parked this way. They were all parked this way, every row. And so you realize, wait a minute, you can't stay around and talk like my mother did for 30 minutes, or you've blocked everybody behind you. So the assumption is we're all going to get communion, not even sing the last hymn, go straight to the cars, gone. Okay, that's not that relational. You know, there's no coffee hour. It's just gone. It's get the sacrament, but you find a lot of difference now as the lay ministers are touching the congregation in a different way than priests were. So the Catholic Church is not vibrantly growing, but it's growing. They also have more babies than we do. They still do. All right, one more question, and then maybe Jim again.
You mentioned, the churches you're saying that you've got a lot of older people in one and all the millennials in the other. Is that tied into this dance that we're trying to do between contemporary, traditional, and trying to?
Partly.
How do you move?
And Jim, part of it is not only the nature of the music, it's the nature of the relationship. It's less formal, more informal, and millennials tend to like it. Again, there's a slice of them that are very traditional, that will always come to a place like this, but it's a small slice. And part of it has to do with experiential, that worship is something that they feel more than just think. And there's been a certain proclivity among us who are Presbyterians. Don't do anything that's going to make me cry. In fact, I would have people fuss at me at the door, you made me cry today, as if that was a cardinal sin, which meant they felt something. And so I think millennial worship is far more tied to the experiential side. And they do want community. They want not just coffee hour community, though. They like community that's vulnerable, that's transparent, that comes out of an organic relationship, and would have coffee connected with it. I mean, there's something about holding a cup of coffee and in one hand and a phone in the other that is relational for them. And so I tend to poo-poo this, no, we don't need to do that. You need to get Calvin's Institutes or something. But I'm trying to, there is something here that is a tremendous value, that is more than just two services in two different rooms. But again, if you were saying formula, I would go, 18,000 mostly young adults moving into downtown San Antonio. There might be a need to have a more missional kind of service of worship that would be targeted to them on a time that might work for them, that might not disturb everybody's cheese on Sunday morning, that would be risking becoming a Mickey Mouse ear out here. And sometimes a whole group of millennials. Christ Church, Edina, Minnesota, they had a whole group called Solomon's Porch that just left because they didn't like the Presbyterian rules about who could serve communion. And ECO is trying to say, we need to rethink a lot of rules. Does it have to be seminary hands to break bread? Or could other people, I'm a sacramentalist, I've been happy in this world, but I'm thinking, seminaries are down in enrollment like mine is. Because the majority of people starting churches have no seminary degree. I think they're going to run out of steam when they're about 40, but they're doing it. And they're actually doing it somewhat better. Bill Hybels has no seminary degree. A lot of people had no seminary degree and did pretty well. And so those hands are ordained in a way that a Presbyterian is not. But it's working. 1/2 of all churches now are independent because they don't like a bunch of rules from above. 1/2 of all Protestant churches west of the Rockies are independent. And that trend is moving eastward fast. And it's right here in Carolina. So I just think you got to keep thinking, how could we do it here, given our resources now? And if a building, your sanctuary is fairly underutilized for all the cubic feet that it has. Would you want it to be 7 days a week like Qasr el-Dabar? Maybe. But if you go to Qasr el-Dabar, you just get swept up in worship there. I mean, Islamic or Arabic people in Egypt do not worship in a tame way. There's tambourines and dancing in the aisles. And I remember Helen Reeves once told me, I'll go with you, but if I fall down in an HEB and start getting slain in the spirit, I'm done. And I go, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. But why are we God's frozen chosen? And is that really an essential part of the package? Or is that a cultural part? I'm just not sure. All right, Ben, you get the last word, and then it's 4 o'clock.
Is your experience, you've been a lot of places, that a church like this that is chosen for can change?
Yes. Yeah, the missional strategy, Ben, is working on the assumption of adaptive change. And adaptive change, I'll borrow the chalkboard 1 second to draw you a picture. The adaptive change that usually makes culture change is if you think of the First Pres as a whole, you think, well, we've got at the session level to change the core and let that change radiate out. It's very hard for an existing institution of any type to make remarkable change at the core. Ask Kodak, when digital was coming in, they just didn't want to make a change at the core. But change in a missional sense and in a movement sense happens from the fringe inward. As you have missional experiments around the edges, that if you let 2 or 3 of them go and 4 or 5 of them that you would even expect to be failures, but you just keep trying, eventually those have the effect of changing the core from the outside in instead of from the inside out. And that's what you're finding in the churches that are pulling this off. They're letting missional communities happen on the fringe, and they work their influence to the center, rather than making a whole big center decision. We actually tried to persuade the PCUSA of this. Why don't you just let churches begin to act differently on the fringe, and then you don't have to deal with this big no. See, that's an institution, doesn't want its core to change. A friend of mine in change theories looked at what we were trying to do in the PCUSA and said, they'll never do it. Organizations like that never voluntarily make change at the core. Changes have to occur at the center. And I would say the same thing for a place like here. It won't happen at the core, even though you're the core. It's too risky to change the whole thing. So let the experiment start. And risk the hiring of some people to do things on the edge. Tuesday night, Thursday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. And just think, how would we pull that off? All right, you've been very patient. And only 2 of you have fallen consistently asleep. Hey, which too. But I want to just pray for this session because, again, I don't think there's any church I natively cheer for more than you, because you've just been in my heart for 34 years.